How was your day? Relax and enjoy the story.
At 2 in the morning, an alarm went off in a building I owned, 200 yards from where I sat drinking cold coffee in the dark. I already knew who was inside. I'd known for 8 months, and I did the strangest thing a man can do while he's being robbed. I let him. I sat there and watched it happen on a screen, and I didn't call the police, and I didn't move. Because the man walking through my building, carrying off what he believed was 30 years of my life's work, he was my daughter's husband. 3 weeks later, in a room full of people, that same man looked my daughter in the eye and told her she had never been anything more than a door, a way in. 9 years of marriage, a child they'd raised together. And he said it the way you'd describe a tool you were finished using. But I'm telling you the end before the beginning. And that isn't fair to you. Because to understand how a man could say something like that to my daughter's face and why I let him keep believing he'd won, right up until the moment he didn't, I have to take you back. All the way back to a cool October evening and a dinner I should have trusted my instincts about. My name is Eugene Harwell. For 30 years, I built a company called Harwell Naturals out of a converted warehouse in East Nashville. We made nutraceuticals, plant extracts, herbal formulations, concentrated compounds I developed from scratch in my own lab. Nothing flashy. No celebrity faces on the bottles. Just clean products that worked. Built on proprietary formulas I spent a decade perfecting and protected like they were family. Because in a way, they were. At our peak, we served over 40,000 customers across 32 states. Oncologists referred patients to us. People waited months for 3 of our products. Not because we were the biggest, because we were trusted. That trust took 30 years to build. It took Trevor Ashby considerably less time to try to steal it. But on that October evening in 2015, I didn't know any of what was coming. I only knew that my daughter had called that morning, breathless, asking if she could bring someone to dinner. Her name is Diane. She was 28 that fall sharp. Funny. Full of opinions about everything from jazz to furniture design. She'd built a small interior design business from nothing, working 16-hour days, charming clients twice her age. She had her mother's warmth and, God help her, my stubbornness. I had always considered that a gift. She arrived at 6:30 with Trevor Ashby, 30 years old, MBA from Vanderbilt, a dark suit that looked casual but cost more than my first car. His handshake was firm, his eye contact was precise. He said, "Mr. Harwell, it's a genuine honor. Diane talks about you and Harwell Naturals constantly." He smiled at exactly the right moment. I noticed that. The smile came a half-second after the words. Like a man who'd practiced the timing. My wife Margaret made her pot roast, set out the good dishes. The first hour was pleasant. Trevor asked about Diane's childhood, laughed at the right stories, complimented the food twice. Diane kept glancing at him with the look young people get when they believe they've found something rare. I recognized it. I'd looked at Margaret the same way, 40 years earlier. I wanted to trust that look. Then, somewhere between the main course and the apple pie, Trevor leaned back in his chair and said, "The cold press extraction method you developed for your turmeric line that's genuinely innovative. You hold the patent on that. Correct, the low-temperature binding stage is the key, isn't it? Protects the bioavailability." The table went quiet for just a moment. Margaret glanced at me. He was right. Completely. Specifically right. But the cold press binding process he'd just described was not public. It existed in exactly 3 places: our internal research files, our patent application, and a single closed-door presentation I'd given in 2013 to an audience of 11 people. "Where did you say you read about that?" I asked. "Some trade brief," he said, without missing a breath. "I read everything I can in the health sciences space. It's where the real opportunities are over the next decade." I did not say anything else at the table. Later that night, after they'd left, I mentioned it to Margaret. "He researched the company," she said, rinsing dishes. "He's trying to impress you. That's what men do when they want to marry someone's daughter. He knew details that aren't public." "Margaret." She turned and gave me the patient look she reserves for moments when she thinks I'm overcomplicating something simple. "Eugene, our daughter is happy. For the first time in 2 years, she's happy. Don't do this." I looked out the kitchen window at the dark Tennessee evening, and I made a decision that would cost my family 9 years. I chose Diane's happiness over my instincts. Here is the thing: nobody warns you about losing a child to another person. It doesn't happen in a single moment you can point to. There's no slammed door, no screaming match, no clean break you can grieve and move past. It happens so slowly that by the time you're certain it's happening, you've already missed the moment you could have stopped it. They say a frog dropped into boiling water will jump out, but a frog in water that heats 1 degree at a time will sit there until it's too late. I used to think that was just a saying. Then I watched my daughter disappear 1 degree at a time, and I understood it wasn't a saying at all. It was an instruction manual, and Trevor Ashby had clearly read it. Trevor and Diane married in the spring of 2016, a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Franklin. Margaret cried through most of it, the good kind of crying. I walked Diane down the aisle and handed her to a man whose smile still arrived a half-second too late. And I told myself, again, that I was just an overprotective father who couldn't accept his daughter had grown up. I would tell myself a great many things over the next 9 years. That is the part I have the hardest time forgiving. The first year was fine. Diane kept her design business. She called on Sundays. They came to dinner once or twice a month, and Trevor was attentive and pleasant and asked intelligent questions about the company. Then, so gradually, I couldn't tell you the week it started. The calls began coming less often. It started with reasonable things. Trevor had suggested she scale back her client load. They were thinking about starting a family, and the stress wasn't good for that. Sensible, on its face. Diane laughed it off when I asked, "Dad, it's fine. I'm just taking a breath." She took a breath that lasted 4 years. By 2018, she'd let her last 2 major clients go. She talked about design the way you talk about a town you used to live in fondly, in the past tense. I noticed. I said nothing. Margaret said I was projecting. Then came the friends. One by one, the women Diane had known since college stopped being mentioned. Her closest friend from design school, a woman named Paula who'd been in our home 100 times, simply vanished from conversation. When I asked, Diane said, "Oh, Paula and I grew apart. She never really understood what I'm building with Trevor." What I'm building with Trevor, as if the marriage were a project, and anyone who questioned it was an obstacle to be removed. I have spent my life as a chemist. I look for patterns. Sometimes that's a gift, and sometimes it makes you see shapes and shadows that aren't there. So I kept telling myself the shadows weren't real, that a careful man like me was simply prone to seeing threats where there were none. But the pattern kept building. By 2019, Trevor had taken over their finances completely. Diane mentioned it one evening, the way you'd mention rearranging the furniture. Trevor handles all that now. It's easier. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. I asked if she had her own account. She said they had a joint account. I asked if she could access it herself. She changed the subject. That was the Thanksgiving before Gracie was born. I remember it precisely, because it was the last holiday where my daughter still laughed the way she had as a girl, that full laugh that came from somewhere real, somewhere Trevor hadn't reached yet. After Gracie arrived in early 2020, the laughter didn't disappear. It just got quieter, more careful, like something she'd learned to ration. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you may need to hear it. I saw all of this happening. I was not a fool, and I was not blind. I watched a man methodically remove every door my daughter might walk out of: her work, her friends, her money, her own voice, and I told myself, every single time, that it wasn't my place, that she was an adult. That pushing would only drive her further away. And the terrible thing is, that last part was true. I brought it up with Margaret one Sunday morning in the spring of 2021. We were on the back porch with our coffee, watching the dogwoods bloom the way they do in Tennessee in April, like the trees are apologizing for the winter. Something is wrong, I said. With Diane. With that marriage. Margaret was quiet a long moment. Then she said, I know. It was the first time either of us had said it out loud. I looked at her, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not denial, not reassurance. Something older and sadder than both. I would not understand until years later exactly what she was carrying behind that expression, or how long she'd been carrying it. What do we do? I asked. I don't know, she said. She's not ready to hear it. If we push, we lose her. She was right. I had seen it happen in other families. A parent sounds the alarm too loudly, too early, and the child retreats deeper into the very place you're trying to pull them from. Love, aimed wrong, becomes a wall. So we waited. We kept Sunday dinners open. We called, consistently, even when the calls felt thin and managed and supervised. We made sure Diane knew the door was always there, even when we couldn't make her walk through it. It was the hardest patience I have ever practiced. Harder than building a business. Harder than anything in a laboratory. Because in a lab, when an experiment fails, you change the variables and try again. With your own child, sometimes all you can do is stay close, keep the light on, and pray they find their way back before it's too late. Most Sundays, I called the house at noon. More and more often. It was Trevor who picked up. There is a particular kind of foolishness that only intelligent men are capable of. It's the foolishness of believing that because you saw the danger coming, you're somehow protected from it. I saw Trevor Ashby coming for 9 years. I saw him at that first dinner. I saw him erase my daughter 1 degree at a time. And then, in the spring of 2020, I did something so foolish that I still have trouble saying it out loud. I handed him the keys to everything I'd built. I let him walk straight into Harwell Naturals, gave him a desk, a title, and access to the company I'd spent 30 years protecting. And I did it with my eyes open, knowing exactly the kind of man he was. You're going to want to know why. I asked myself the same question for a long time. The answer, when I finally found it, was simpler and worse than I expected. But I'll get to that. It started with a phone call. Diane called one evening in late January. In that careful, slightly braced voice she'd developed by then, the voice of a woman always half prepared for disappointment. Trevor was between consulting contracts, she said. He'd been doing some analysis of Harwell Naturals on his own, just out of interest, just because he cared about the family business. He had ideas. Would I be willing to sit down with him? I said yes. For her. Because she'd asked in that voice. And I was so tired of being one more disappointment in a life I could see was getting smaller. That, I realized later, was exactly how he'd planned it. He never asked me for anything directly. He asked through Diane, because he knew I would refuse him and I would never refuse her. So Trevor came in on a Thursday morning, sat across from my desk, and talked for 45 minutes about market positioning and supply chain modernization and what he called the untapped enterprise channel. It was polished, genuinely well constructed. At the end, he said, "With the right structure, Harwell Naturals could triple its revenue in 4 years. I'd like to help you get there." In a formal capacity, I looked at him across that desk. I thought about the cold press process he shouldn't have known about, the smile that arrived half a second late. And I said yes anyway. Frank Delgado pulled me aside that same afternoon. Frank had been with me 19 years by then, quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who notices everything and says only what's necessary. He stood in my doorway with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded slowly. "Okay then." And he went back to his desk. That was Frank. He didn't push. He just made sure I knew I was walking into something. And once he saw that I did, he stayed close enough to help me out of it later. I would need him to. More than I knew. Trevor started the following Monday with the title of Director of Business Development. Within 3 months, he'd reorganized the administrative structure, brought in 2 staff members I hadn't interviewed, and scheduled a series of meetings that somehow always landed when Frank had a conflict. I noticed that. I was noticing everything by then. I just wasn't doing anything about it yet, and there's a reason for that, which I'll come to. By summer, he'd proposed bringing on an outside board advisor, a man named Garrett Sims from Atlanta, introduced as a healthcare industry consultant. Sims sat in on 2 board meetings, said almost nothing, and studied our operational documents with the focused attention of a man memorizing rather than advising. Frank ran him through a basic search afterward. Garrett Sims's consulting firm had exactly 1 client on record in 3 years. A pharmaceutical acquisition company based in Atlanta. I filed that away. Said nothing. Not yet. Through the fall of 2022, Trevor's requests sharpened. He wanted expanded access to our research archives. He suggested digitizing the original formula documentation for efficiency, he said, so everything's accessible in one place. He proposed routing departmental budgets through his office before they reached Frank. Each request, on its own, was reasonable. Each one could be explained by a dozen innocent motives. But I had spent 30 years in a laboratory, and I understood that a single data point means nothing, and that the same data points, viewed together, can form a picture you cannot unsee. What they formed was a picture I did not like. I brought Frank into my office one evening in November, after everyone had gone home. I closed the door. I told him what I was seeing. He listened without interrupting. Then he opened the folder he'd brought and laid it on my desk. 3 months of anomalies in our access logs. Research files opened after midnight from a device he didn't recognize. Formula documentation accessed and printed twice from a terminal that required a passcode only 4 people held. How long ago? I asked. First anomaly was April, Frank said. I didn't want to bring it to you until it was a pattern instead of a coincidence. And now it's a pattern. I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 30 years of formulas. 40,000 customers who trusted us. Diane in our house. Gracie asleep in her bed. And Trevor, somewhere across town, sitting at his kitchen table, perfectly calm, perfectly patient. A man who spends years building access before he makes his move is not a man you stop by confronting him. He'll have an explanation ready. He always does. You stop a man like that by being more patient than he is. Don't change anything, I told Frank. Don't move a file. Don't alter a log. Give him no reason to think we've noticed. And when he asks for more access, give it to him, I said. Let him think he's getting closer. Frank looked at me steadily. And what are you going to do? I looked at the quiet, methodical evidence on my desk. The work of a man who'd been planning this since before I ever gave him a key. I'm going to find out exactly what he wants, I said. Then I'm going to take it away from him so completely that when I finally say no, he hears it for the rest of his life. It took me 3 months to decide how to say no. Not the word itself. The word is easy. I mean the kind of no that a man like Trevor Ashby cannot argue around, cannot charm his way past, cannot explain away to my daughter over Sunday dinner. The kind of no that arrives with federal agents and court dates and a paper trail too deep to climb out of. To build that kind of no, I first had to do something that went against every instinct I had. I had to let him believe he was winning. And to make a careful man believe he's winning, you cannot simply step back and watch. You have to give him a reason. You have to become the one thing a predator like Trevor had been waiting 9 years to see. You have to become weak. The best performance of my life started on a Tuesday morning in March, when I walked into a board meeting and forgot Trevor's name. Not completely. I caught myself halfway through a sentence, paused, looked at him with the slightly unfocused expression I'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror for 2 weeks, and said, I'm sorry, Tyler. Was it, I've been mixing up names lately? Margaret says I need more sleep. His name is Trevor. I have known his name for 8 years. I said it wrong on purpose, and I watched his eyes very carefully when I did. What I saw there was not concern. It was calculation, just a flicker half a second, quickly covered by a warm smile and a gentle correction. Trevor, Eugene, no worries at all. He reached over and patted my hand, the way you pat the hand of someone you've already begun to think of in the past tense. That single flicker told me everything about his timeline. He wasn't worried I was slipping. He was glad. I had spent the previous 3 months building the ground beneath that performance. In December, Frank and I had quietly moved the original formula documentation, every notebook, every research file going back to 1994, to a secured off-site location. What remained in the Harwell Naturals archive was a complete, convincing replica. Same binders, same labels, same organization, different contents, useless to anyone who tried to actually use what they described. In January, I'd retained an intellectual property attorney named Patricia Odom and a forensic consultant named Dr. Lena Cho. Lena spent 2 weeks auditing our systems and confirmed what Frank's logs had suggested. Someone had been methodically mapping our network for months. She also found something Frank hadn't: A small wireless transmitter tucked behind a server panel in the archive room. Professional grade. Not the kind of thing you buy off a shelf. The kind you install when you intend to listen for a long time. I had it photographed, documented, and left exactly where it was. Let him keep listening. From that point on, everything he heard was something I wanted him to hear. The performance itself took discipline I didn't know I had. I am not an actor. I'm a precise man. I measure things. I document things. I say what I mean. Pretending to be something I wasn't went against 67 years of how I'd built myself. But then I thought about Diane. I thought about 8 years of watching her perform a version of herself for Trevor's benefit. The performance of a woman who was fine, who was happy, who didn't need anything she wasn't being handed. If my daughter could hold that performance for 8 years under real duress, I could manage a few months of forgetfulness under conditions I controlled. So I practiced. I forgot words mid-sentence. I brought the wrong files to meetings. I asked Frank questions I knew the answers to, loudly enough for Nora Castile, Trevor's assistant, whose loyalty I'd correctly judged to be purchased rather than earned to overhear from her desk. And I repeated stories. That was the detail that landed hardest. There's something about a man telling the same story twice in one conversation that signals a particular kind of decline to people watching for it. I told a story about my first formula batch at a company lunch, then told it again 20 minutes later, and watched Trevor's expression shift each time, not toward worry, toward opportunity. Margaret hated every moment of it. She knew, of course. I'd told her everything in February, sitting at our kitchen table late at night, the logs, the transmitter, the replica archive, Patricia. She listened without interrupting, which is not her nature, and when I finished, she was quiet a long time before she squeezed my hand once, hard, and nodded. She was remarkable through all of it. Every dinner. She played the worried wife with an authenticity I could never have manufactured because part of her worry was real. She'd been worried about Diane for years. The performance just gave her somewhere to put it. On the last Thursday of March, I left my office door slightly open during a phone call with Frank, a call I'd told him to expect and play straight. Loud enough for the hallway to hear. I mentioned that I was having trouble remembering the archive access codes and had written them down somewhere in my desk. The codes I mentioned were real. They opened the replica archive. By 4 o'clock, Nora Castile had left the building twice. Unusual for a Thursday. I noted both times. By 6, a notification appeared on the secure monitoring app Frank had installed. Someone had queried the replica archive access terminal remotely, and at 6:47, sitting in my car in the parking lot before driving home, I saw Trevor through his office window, phone pressed to his ear, facing away from the glass. I couldn't hear a word. I didn't need to. I could read it in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward lean, the way his free hand moved when he was driving a point home. It was the kind of call a man makes when something he's been waiting a very long time for has finally started moving. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from performing weakness in front of the people who have known your strength for 40 years. Margaret and I have been married since 1983. We met at a conference in Knoxville. She was presenting research on plant alkaloid extraction. I was in the audience taking notes so fast I broke 2 pencils. I introduced myself afterward and talked for 20 minutes without once asking her a question, which she has reminded me of regularly in the 4 decades since. She said she married me anyway, because anyone that passionate about plant chemistry was either brilliant or unhinged. And she figured either way it would be interesting. She was right on both counts. 41 years. We had built a life together the way you build a good formula carefully, with attention to what each element contributes, willing to start over when something wasn't working. We had raised Diane in this house. We had buried Margaret's mother from this house. We had sat in this kitchen through every hard thing that had come our way and talked it through until we found the ground again. I had never kept anything from her for longer than it took me to find the right words. Keeping the full scope of what I was doing from her through February and into March was the hardest thing I had done in our marriage. Not because I didn't trust her, because I trusted her completely. And deceiving someone you trust completely has a particular weight that deception of strangers never carries. She knew the broad outline. She had agreed to it. But there were details I had withheld, specific elements of the plan I had been afraid would worry her more than the situation warranted, or that might, if she knew them, show on her face in a moment when Trevor was watching. The first Saturday of April, after 3 weeks of the performance. I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and an expression that told me the conversation I had been postponing was no longer optional. I sat down across from her. "Tell me the rest," she said. Not angry, not accusatory. Just Margaret, who had always known when I was editing myself. So I told her. I told her about Garrett Sims and the Vantara Group connection Frank had traced. I told her about the wireless transmitter Lena had found in the archive room. I told her about the replica documentation and exactly what it contained, enough authentic detail to be convincing on a surface examination. Enough deliberate gaps to be useless for anyone trying to replicate our actual formulas. I told her about the monitoring software Frank had installed on our archive terminal, which logged every access attempt with timestamp, device, ID, and duration. I told her that in 3 weeks, we had recorded 11 unauthorized queries, all from the same device, all between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. I told her about Patricia Odom and the criminal referral she was preparing for the FBI's White-Collar Crimes Division in Nashville. I told her that Special Agent Marcus Webb had already reviewed the preliminary evidence and indicated that when we were ready to move, he was prepared to move with us. Margaret listened to all of it without speaking. She refilled her wine once. She looked out the window at the backyard twice, at nothing in particular. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The transmitter in the archive room," she said finally. "When did he put it there?" Lena traced the installation to a Saturday in October when Trevor came in to pick up some documents. He was alone in the building for about 20 minutes. While we were at Diane's for her birthday dinner. Yes, she absorbed that. Her jaw tightened slightly. The only visible sign of what I knew was a significant internal reckoning. Trevor had sat at our daughter's birthday dinner and smiled and helped Gracie cut her cake, while a listening device he had planted that same afternoon transmitted from our archive room. "Does Diane know any of this?" Margaret asked. "No. She needs to know eventually. She will. When it's over. When there's nothing he can do about it." Margaret looked at her wine glass. "And in the meantime, I watch you pretend to forget our anniversary and mix up the grandchildren's names at Sunday dinner. I don't think I need to go that far. You called Frank Bill twice last week at the office. That was genuine," I admitted. "I've called Frank Bill since 2007. It has nothing to do with the performance." She almost smiled. Almost. "Eugene. Margaret. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does," I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cool from holding the wine glass. I had held this hand through 41 years of hard conversations, and I knew its weight exactly the way you know the weight of something you have carried long enough that it becomes part of how you understand yourself. If it goes wrong, I said, we lose the business. Trevor gets what he came for, and we deal with that. But we don't lose Diane. Not permanently. Because whatever happens with Harwell Naturals, what we're really doing here is making sure she gets to see exactly who she married. Without my word against his. Without him being able to explain it away. She gets to see the evidence herself. Margaret turned her hand over and held mine properly. That's the part that matters, she said quietly. That's always been the part that matters. We sat there in our kitchen for a while after that. The way you sit with someone when words have done what they can, and the rest is just being present. Outside. The Tennessee spring was doing what it does, moving toward warmth in that slow, certain way that makes you believe, no matter what the winter was, that things can come back. I thought about my daughter. I thought about a trap I had been setting for 8 months. I thought about what a stubborn old man could do when he finally decided he had been patient long enough. My granddaughter Gracie has always been a collector. Rocks, mostly. She has a shelf in her bedroom dedicated entirely to stones she has picked up from driveways, creek beds, parking lots, and one memorable occasion, the gravel path outside a Whole Foods in Green Hills that she insisted had special color. She also collects bottle caps, interesting buttons, and what she calls good trash, small discarded objects that catch her eye for reasons she cannot always explain but defends with considerable conviction. She is 11 years old, and she is, without question, the best person I know. She came over on a Sunday in November with Margaret's permission and my quiet invitation, ostensibly to help me organize the garage, which had accumulated the particular chaos that garages accumulate when the person responsible for them has been spending the previous 8 months focused on other things. In reality, I wanted her company. The performance had been wearing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Spending time with Gracie required nothing. She accepted people exactly as they presented themselves, which, given that I had been presenting myself as a man in cognitive decline for 8 months, was something of a relief. She arrived at 10 in the morning, wearing a puffy orange coat 2 sizes too large. Trevor's, I realized. One of those fleece-lined things he wore on weekends. She had borrowed it, she explained, because her own jacket was wet from a soccer game the previous morning, and she hadn't wanted to wait for it to dry. We worked through the garage for 2 hours. She sorted hardware into bins with the focused efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoys categorization, which she gets from Margaret's side of the family. I moved boxes and tried not to let it show that my back had opinions about the whole enterprise. Around noon, she reached into the oversized coat pocket looking for the granola bar she had stashed there earlier and came up with something else instead. Grandpa. She held it up between 2 fingers, examining it with the evaluating squint she applies to potential additions to her collection. What's this? It was a USB drive. Matte black, no markings, no manufacturer logo, roughly the size of a large eraser, the kind of anonymous, deliberately unremarkable storage device you buy when you don't want anyone to know what you're storing. I knew what it was before I touched it. I had not planted it. I had not arranged for it to be there. In 8 months of careful, methodical preparation, this was the one thing I had not planned for the one variable I had not controlled, which meant it was either nothing, a random piece of Trevor's tech clutter, the kind of thing that accumulates in pockets and desk drawers, or it was everything. Can I keep it? Gracie asked. It's the perfect size for my small things box. I took it from her carefully, turning it over in my palm. No heat, no indicator light. Powered down completely. "Let me check if it's something I need for work first," I said. "If it's not, you can have it back." She accepted this with the easy trust of a child who has never had a reason not to trust her grandfather, and went back to sorting a bin of miscellaneous screws with complete equanimity. Within 4 minutes, she had forgotten about it entirely and moved on to explaining to me why certain rocks have better energy than others. A theory she was developing based on criteria I did not fully follow but found entirely compelling. I put the drive in my shirt pocket. I finished the garage. I made Gracie a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, the way she likes it: sharp cheddar, butter on the outside, pressed flat in the pan until the edges are slightly crispy. We ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about a project she was doing at school on the water cycle, which she felt had been unfairly simplified by her teacher, and about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend that had been resolved through the diplomatic mechanism of sharing a bag of chips at recess. I listened to all of it. I was present for all of it. And in my shirt pocket, against my chest, the drive sat with the particular weight of something that might be nothing and might be the answer to 8 months of questions. After Margaret drove Gracie home, I went to my study and closed the door. I sat at my desk for a moment before picking up the phone to call Frank. Outside the window, the November light was doing what it does in Tennessee in late fall, going golden and thin, the way it goes just before the gray sets in for winter. I thought about what Frank had told me in October when we had reviewed the latest access logs together. 43 unauthorized queries in 7 months. Someone systematically copying fragments of our replica data in pieces small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Someone who had been inside our system long enough and carefully enough to understand exactly how our monitoring thresholds worked. Someone who had been this close to what he needed for a very long time. I looked at the drive in my palm. Then I picked up the phone. My hands were not shaking from age. They were not shaking from the performance I had been maintaining for 8 months. They were shaking from the particular sensation of a man who has been building toward something for a very long time and has just felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that tells him the end is closer than he thought. I already knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 30 years learning to trust his own data, what was on that drive. I called Frank anyway, because knowing and proving are 2 different things, and I had not come this far to stop at knowing. Frank Delgado arrived at my house at 9:45 that Sunday night, with 2 equipment cases, a thermos of coffee he did not offer to share, and the expression of a man who had already prepared himself for bad news and was simply waiting to find out how bad. He had been that way for 19 years. It was one of the reasons I trusted him above everyone else at Harwell Naturals. Frank did not catastrophize and he did not minimize. He assessed. He was the most useful kind of person in a crisis, not the kind who tells you everything will be fine, and not the kind who tells you the sky is falling. The kind who looks at the sky carefully and gives you an accurate weather report. I met him at the door and took him straight to my study. Margaret had gone to bed. The house was quiet in the particular way houses get quiet on Sunday nights in November settled. Dark. The heat ticking through the baseboards. I handed him the drive without preamble. He set it on my desk, pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from his equipment case, and examined it under a small LED lamp before connecting it to what he called his forensic laptop, an isolated machine with no network connection, used exclusively for situations exactly like this one. "Where did you find it?" he asked, not looking up. Gracie did. Trevor's coat pocket. Frank's hands paused for just a moment. Then he continued working. She know what it is. She thought it might be a good addition to her rock collection. He almost smiled. Almost. Smart kid. She gets it from Margaret. The drive connected. Frank ran his initial scan in silence. I sat in the chair across from my desk and watched him work. The way I had watched him work for nearly 2 decades, with the particular confidence of a man who knows the person across from him is better at this specific task than he is and has the wisdom to stay out of the way. After 12 minutes, he sat back in his chair. "It's encrypted," he said. "Military grade. Same architecture as the transmitter Lena found in the archive room." He paused. "But there's a secondary partition, poorly hidden, like it was meant to be accessed quickly under pressure." "What's in it?" "Give me a few more minutes." I gave him the minutes. Outside, a car passed on the street. The heat ticked. I drank the coffee I had made for myself before Frank arrived, which had gone cold. When Frank spoke again, his voice had the particular flatness he used when he was controlling something. "Eugene," he said, "this is the whole thing." I looked at him. Not fragments, not the replica. This is the actual formula documentation. Every proprietary extraction process, every binding protocol, every compound ratio going back to 1994. He turned the laptop screen toward me. Complete. Unencrypted on the secondary partition. Ready to transfer. I looked at the screen. 30 years of work rendered into a file directory. Neat folders, clear labels. Everything we had spent 3 decades developing. Compiled and packaged with the careful organization of someone who had been studying our system long enough to know exactly how we named and stored things. "How did he get the real documentation?" I asked. "We moved everything in December." Frank was quiet for a moment. He ran another query, checked something, ran it again. The physical files. "Yes," he said. "But these aren't scans of physical documents." He pointed to the screen. "These are exports from our digital archive, the original digital files, before we completed the migration to the new system in September." He looked at me. "He pulled these in August. Eugene, 3 months before you moved the physical files. Before we knew to look, August. While I was running the replica archive operation and congratulating myself on my preparation, Trevor had already extracted what he needed from our digital system during a window I hadn't thought to close. He's been sitting on this since August," I said. "Looks that way. Then why did he keep accessing the archive? Why the 11 unauthorized queries after August?" Frank closed the laptop and looked at me steadily. "Because he didn't know he had what he needed. The August extraction was automated. He set a script to pull everything matching certain file parameters. But the script pulled from an older directory structure. He got the files, but they're labeled in our pre-2017 naming convention." He paused. "He's been going back to the archive because he can't verify what he has without comparing it to the current files. He knows he pulled something. He doesn't know if it's complete." I sat with that for a moment. Trevor had the real formulas in his pocket for 4 months and didn't know it with certainty. He had been breaking into our digital archive repeatedly, risking detection because he needed confirmation. He needed to match what he had stolen against what currently existed to be sure he had taken the right thing. And instead of confirmation, he had sent his daughter to my house in an oversized borrowed coat, and the coat had ended up in my garage, and Gracie had reached into the pocket looking for a granola bar. "There's something else," Frank said. He reopened the laptop and navigated to the secondary partition's metadata. Creation date on the compiled package, February 2015. I looked at him. He started building the extraction framework 9 months before he married Diane. Frank said quietly. The folder structure, the file parameters for the automated script, the encryption wrapper. It was all set up 9 months before the wedding. The room was very still. He never loved her. I said. It was not a question. I had known it for years in the way you know things you cannot yet prove. But knowing it and seeing it time-stamped in a file directory were two entirely different experiences. Frank closed the laptop. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has given you the accurate weather report and is sorry about what the weather is. Eugene, he said. This started before he married Diane. Maybe before he ever walked through your door, 3 weeks after Frank and I sat in my study with that USB drive between us. My daughter called me at 11:58 at night. Not Trevor. Diane. I was still awake. I had not been sleeping well through any of this, which was the one aspect of the performance that required no acting at all, sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water and the particular stillness of a house at midnight when everyone else is asleep. When my phone lit up and I saw her name, something in my chest did a thing it had not done in a long time. She was calling from a number I didn't recognize. Dad. Her voice was low, careful. The way you speak when you are in a room where you do not want to be heard. Diane. I kept my voice even. Are you all right? I'm in my car, she said. In the parking lot of a Walgreens on Charlotte Avenue. Trevor thinks I went to get NyQuil. Gracie has a cold. A pause. I needed to talk to you without I needed to talk to you. I waited. Something's wrong, she said. With Trevor, with what he's doing. I've known something was wrong for a while. But 3 weeks ago I heard him on the phone late at night and She stopped. I could hear her breathing, steady and deliberate, the way she used to breathe before a difficult conversation when she was a teenager. Preparing herself. He was talking to someone about Harwell Naturals, about the formulas, about a delivery deadline. Another pause. Dad, he said if he missed the deadline, he'd lose the deposit. I was quiet for a moment. How much of the conversation did you hear? I asked. Enough. He mentioned $3.2 million. He mentioned a company called Vantara. Her voice tightened. I looked it up the next morning. Dad. Vantara Group is a pharmaceutical acquisition firm. They buy intellectual property from smaller companies and I know what they do, I said gently. Silence on the line. Then, slowly, you already know. Yes, the silence that followed was the kind that has weight. I could hear her processing it, not with anger, not yet, but with the particular quality of understanding that arrives when something you have been half-knowing for a long time finally steps fully into the light. How long? She asked. I've had confirmed evidence for about a month. I've suspected longer. How much longer? I considered how honest to be. Then I thought about Frank's weather report, about accurate information delivered steadily, about what my daughter deserved after 9 years of being managed and handled by a man who had decided what she needed to know. Since before you married him, I said. Not proof, but suspicion. Another silence. Longer this time. I need to see you, she said. Not at the house. Not anywhere he might. I need to see you, somewhere he won't know about. We arranged it for the following Thursday. A place called the Blue Lantern Cafe in Franklin. 30 minutes south of Nashville, where neither of us had ever been and Trevor had no reason to know about. 11 in the morning, a weekday, when Trevor would be at the office and Gracie would be at school. I arrived first. The cafe was small and warm, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls and coffee that came in bowls rather than cups. I chose a table in the back corner and ordered something I didn't drink and waited. She came in 10 minutes after me, wearing a gray coat I hadn't seen before. Her hair pulled back. She looked like herself, the self I remembered from before. The one who had opinions about everything and laughed from somewhere real. But there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 9 years ago, and the way she sat down, checking the room before she settled, told me something about how she had learned to move through the world in the years since. We talked for 2 hours. I told her what I could, without compromising the parts of the plan that required Trevor to remain unaware. I told her about the USB drive. I told her about Frank's analysis and the timestamps that preceded their wedding. I did not tell her everything. There were elements I still needed to protect, but I told her enough. I told her the truth about what her husband had been doing since before she married him. She listened the way Frank listened, without interrupting, processing each piece before moving to the next. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee bowl and looked at the table for a long moment. He never... She started, stopped, started again. There was never a version of this where he actually loved me. I don't know what he's capable of feeling, I said carefully. But I know his actions were calculated from the beginning. She nodded slowly, not crying. Something past crying, the dry-eyed recognition of someone who has already done the grief in private, in small pieces, over years, without fully knowing what they were grieving. "What do you need from me?" she asked. The question hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. After 9 years of watching my daughter ask Trevor that question, shaping herself around his needs, his plans, his timeline, hearing her ask it in service of something true felt like a door opening in a house that had been sealed for a very long time. "Nothing that puts you at risk," I said. "Nothing that gives him reason to suspect. But something, when the time comes," I said. "Yes, something." She looked up and met my eyes. In the warm light of that small cafe in Franklin, Tennessee, on a Thursday morning in December, I saw the thing I had been waiting 9 years to see again. The daughter I raised was still in there. The trap was finally ready to close. Harold Stokes has lived 3 houses down from me for 22 years. And in that time, I have learned 2 things about him with absolute certainty. The first is that he makes the best brisket in Brentwood, which is not a small distinction in a part of Tennessee where people have opinions about smoked meat the way other people have opinions about fine wine. The second is that nothing happens on our street that Harold does not notice. He spent 31 years as a detective with the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department before he retired to the Colonial on Sycamore Lane with his wife Beverly and a security camera system that covers, by my rough estimation, approximately 60% of our street. He installed it after a car was broken into 4 houses down in 2018 and took the project considerably further than the situation strictly required. Harold is a man who, when he decides to do something, does it thoroughly. I called him on a Wednesday morning in mid-December, 2 days after my meeting with Diane at the Blue Lantern. I told him I had a question about something he might have seen. He told me to come over at 2 o'clock, and he would put on coffee. His den smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Beverly brought us coffee without being asked, and then disappeared with the practiced discretion of a woman who had spent 3 decades understanding when a conversation required privacy. Harold sat behind a desk that had the organized density of a man who tracks things systematically, which is to say it looked cluttered to anyone else and was, I suspected, perfectly indexed in his own mind. Your son-in-law, Harold said. Before I had finished explaining why I was there, I looked at him. Dark blue Audi. Plates registered to Trevor Ashby, your daughter's husband. He turned to his computer without further preamble. I've been logging it for 4 months. Wasn't sure if I should say something. He's family, technically. Didn't want to cause problems over what might be nothing. He pulled up a spreadsheet alongside a folder of video files. The spreadsheet had dates, times, durations, and a notes column with observations so precise they read like police reports. Because they were, essentially, police reports. Old habits. First logged appearance was August 19th, Harold said. 11:14 at night. Parked 4 houses down. Clear sightline to your front entrance and your driveway. Sat for 17 minutes. Didn't approach. Drove away, August 19th. The same month Frank's analysis had identified as when Trevor extracted the digital files from our archive. How many times total, I asked. Harold consulted the spreadsheet. 7 confirmed sightings over 4 months. Always after 11 at night. Never on a weekend, always midweek. Tuesday through Thursday. Never approached the house. Just watched. He turned the monitor toward me and pulled up the first video file. The footage was grainy in the way of night vision security cameras, but clear enough. Trevor's Audi, parked under the overhang of a large oak tree that put it in shadow but not out of frame. The timestamp read 11:14. The car sat perfectly still for the entire 17 minutes before the headlights came on and it pulled away. Harold played 3 more files. Same pattern each time. Same parking spot. Same duration, give or take a few minutes. Same studied stillness of a man watching a house the way you watch something you are planning to take. Last visit was December 2nd, Harold said. 2 weeks ago. That one was different. He pulled up the final file. The Audi was in its usual spot. But this time, there were 2 people in the car. Harold had noted it in his spreadsheet, second individual, passenger seat, male, could not confirm identity from distance. I ran the plates on the second vehicle, Harold said. He slid a printed sheet across the desk. Arrived separately, parked 2 streets over, Burgundy Lexus, Georgia plates, registered to a corporation. He pointed to the name on the sheet. Meridian Consulting Group, Atlanta, Georgia. I looked up the corporation. Harold continued, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man for whom looking up corporations is a natural response to noticing things. Meridian Consulting Group has one documented client relationship in the past 2 years, a pharmaceutical acquisition firm based in Atlanta. He paused. Called Vantara Group. The room was quiet for a moment. Vantara Group had sent a representative to sit in Trevor's car outside my house on a Tuesday night in December. Not to an office meeting, not to a conference room, to a parked car on a residential street in Brentwood at 11 o'clock at night. 2 weeks before Trevor planned to make his move. That was not due diligence. That was supervision. Harold, I said, can I get copies of all of this so already made them? He slid a flash drive across the desk without ceremony, the way he had probably handed over evidence for 31 years. Clean, documented, chain of custody intact. Dates, times, plate numbers, footage. Everything time-stamped by the camera system, which syncs to an atomic clock, so the times are accurate to the second. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the expression of a man who had spent 3 decades reading situations and knew how to read this one. "Eugene," he said, "I've been a detective for a long time. I know what surveillance looks like. I know what it looks like when someone is watching a house because they care about the people in it." He paused. "And I know what it looks like when someone is watching a house because they're planning something." He tapped the flash drive I was now holding. "That's the second kind." I looked at the drive in my hand. Frank's weather report in my study 3 weeks ago. Diane's face across the table at the blue lantern. Margaret's hand on the cold railing. And now Harold's 31 years of knowing what things looked like. Confirming what I already knew in terms that would hold up in any room I needed them to hold up in. Every piece had found its place. The last piece had just fallen into it. At 2:07 in the morning, on a Tuesday in January, my phone vibrated once on the kitchen table. I was already awake. I had been awake since 11, sitting in the dark kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the back window and the way the winter light from the neighbor's porch caught the frost on the grass. I had not turned on the lights. I find darkness easier to think in. Always have. Margaret says it is because I spent too many years working with light-sensitive compounds and learned to default to the dark. She is probably right. The alert was from the Harwell Naturals security system. Motion detected at the rear service entrance. Camera 4. I opened the monitoring app and looked at the feed. Trevor Ashby was standing at the back door of my building in a dark jacket and dark pants, a small bag over one shoulder, working the keypad with the focused efficiency of someone who had practiced the sequence. He had the access code, one of the codes I had allowed Nora Castile to overhear me mention in October. The one I had then quietly changed the real locks to not accept while leaving the code active in the system log so it would appear valid. The door opened. I set my phone face down on the table and looked at the frost on the grass for a moment. 8 months. 8 months of performance and preparation and patience and the particular discipline of a man who has spent his whole life understanding that the difference between a good formula and a great one is almost always time. 8 months of watching Trevor move through my company and my family with the confidence of someone who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. Tonight, he had entered the wrong room. I picked up my phone and sent 2 messages. The first to Frank. 3 words. He's inside. Go. Frank would begin the remote monitoring sequence from his home office, every camera feed recorded simultaneously to 3 separate encrypted servers, time-stamped, backed up in real time. The second message to Marcus Webb at the FBI field office tonight. Confirmed. Marcus had been on standby for 2 weeks. He would not move tonight. We had agreed that tonight was evidence night, not arrest night. Tonight was about letting Trevor complete what he came to do. Document every second of it, and add the physical act of theft to the case file that was already, in Patricia Odom's precise legal language, overwhelming. I pulled up the camera feeds on my laptop. Camera 1, the main corridor, empty. Camera 2, the administrative wing, dark. Camera 3, the archive room entrance. Trevor moving toward it, unhurried, his phone's flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the dark. Camera 4, the rear entrance, now closed behind him. Camera 5, the server room hallway, empty for now. Camera 6, my office, empty. He knew the layout. He had walked these halls for 3 years as director of business development, attended meetings in every room, eaten lunch in the break room, stood at my office window and looked out at East Nashville and talked about the future of the company. He had used that access to memorize every corner of the place. Now he moved through it like a man following a map he had drawn himself. I watched him reach the archive room door. He paused, looked both ways down the corridor, an automatic, professional gesture, the kind you develop when you have done something like this before or prepared for it very carefully. Then he produced a key from his jacket pocket, a physical key. Not a copied one. I had changed the physical locks in November. This key worked because I had left a specific lock on the archive room door that accepted it. A lock I had installed in October, keyed to a copy I had made from a wax impression Frank had taken from Trevor's keyring during a company retreat in September, when Trevor had left his keys on a conference table during a bathroom break. He had a key to a lock I had built for him to open. The archive room door swung inward. I watched him step inside and move directly to the secondary filing cabinet, the one Nora Castile had described to him. I was certain, based on what she had been allowed to see during her months at Harwell Naturals. He did not search. He did not hesitate. He went directly to the third drawer, reached to the back, and retrieved the document box I had placed there in November. He set it on the work table and opened it. Inside were the replica files, the same convincing reproduction I had prepared in December, updated in November to include recent-looking additions that would make it appear current, detailed, authentic in format and structure, useless to anyone who tried to use the actual formulations they described. I had spent considerable time on them. A man who had spent 30 years developing proprietary chemistry knew exactly how to make a fake look real. Trevor lifted the top file and examined it under his flashlight. He flipped through several pages. His shoulders relaxed slightly, a small, visible release of tension that told me he was satisfied with what he was seeing. He thought he had the real thing. He began photographing the documents with his phone, methodical and thorough, working through the box page by page. Every photograph captured by camera 3 from above, every movement logged, every second time-stamped. My phone showed 2:41 when he closed the document box and tucked it under his arm. He moved back toward the archive room door with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who believed he had just won. He stepped into the corridor. He walked toward the rear exit, and I sat in my dark kitchen in Brentwood, watching my son-in-law carry 30 years of carefully prepared nothing out of my building. And I thought about what a stubborn old man could build in 8 months when he finally had enough reason to be thorough. He pushed through the rear door and disappeared into the January dark. I slept 4 hours after Trevor disappeared into the January dark. Not because I was calm, I was not particularly calm, but because I had learned over 8 months that the discipline of rest is as important as the discipline of preparation. And there was nothing more I could do until morning that would not be better done after sleep. Margaret was already awake when I came downstairs at 6. She had made coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her mug, looking out the window at the January yard the way she had been looking at things lately carefully, like she was memorizing them. "He came," she said. Not a question. 2:41 this morning. In and out in 34 minutes. She nodded slowly. He took the files. Everything I left for him. She was quiet for a moment. Outside. A cardinal landed on the bare oak branch closest to the window, a red so vivid against the gray January morning, it looked almost deliberate. Margaret watched it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we watch," I said. "And we wait for him to try to use what he took." Frank called at 7:15. He had been up since 2, running the monitoring sequence, reviewing footage, packaging the recorded files into the evidential format Patricia had specified. His voice had the particular quality it gets when he has been working through the night on something important, slightly flattened, stripped of everything except the relevant information. All 6 feeds recorded clean, he said. Timestamps verified against the atomic clock sync. 41 minutes of continuous footage, no gaps, no corruption. I've got him on camera entering the building, moving through the corridor, opening the archive room, photographing the documents, and exiting. Chain of custody documentation is complete. The photograph sequence, I said. How many frames? 212 individual photographs taken over 19 minutes, all captured by camera 3 from above. You can read the document titles in 37 of the frames. In 14 frames, his face is clearly visible in profile. A pause. Eugene, this is airtight. There is no version of events in which a competent defense attorney explains away 212 photographs taken at 2 in the morning in a locked building. I sat down at the kitchen table across from Margaret. She refilled my coffee without being asked. Has he tried to access the digital archive since last night? I asked. Twice, Frank said. 2:58 and 4:31. Same device as the previous 43 queries. He got home, looked at what he photographed, and immediately tried to cross-reference it against the digital files. A brief pause. Which means he's not certain what he has. That was expected. The replica documentation was convincing in format and structure, but deliberately inconsistent in several technical details that would only become apparent when compared against the digital archive. Trevor would spend the next several days trying to reconcile what he had photographed with what he could access digitally, growing increasingly uncertain about whether he had taken the right thing. Uncertainty, in my experience, makes people move faster than they should. One more thing, Frank said. The USB drive, the real one, the one Gracie found. I finished the secondary analysis last night while I was monitoring. A pause with weight in it. I found embedded metadata in the compiled package. It includes a delivery confirmation template addressed to a contact at Vantara Group. The template references a transfer deadline of February 14th. February 14th, 18 days away. He's running out of time, I said. He's been running out of time since August when he lost the drive. Frank said. He just didn't know it until recently. I thanked him and set the phone down on the table. Margaret was watching me with the expression she uses when she is waiting for me to say out loud the thing she has already understood. 18 days, I said. She nodded. Then we need to move. I called Patricia Odom at 8 o'clock. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting the call. I gave her the summary, the footage, Frank's documentation, the delivery deadline, the metadata. She listened without interrupting, which was her professional default. And when I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Eugene, she said, I've been practicing intellectual property law for 24 years. What you have right now, the footage, the USB, Herald surveillance documentation, the financial analysis, the Vantara connection, the timestamps, this is not a strong case. It is an extraordinary case. The kind that doesn't go to trial because no competent attorney advises their client to take it to trial. How long to prepare the FBI briefing package? I've been preparing it for 3 weeks, she said. It's ready when you are. I looked out the window at the cardinal, still on the branch. 30 years of formulas. 9 years of watching my daughter managed and diminished by a man who had selected her the way you select a tool for what she could open, not for who she was. 8 months of performance and patience, and the particular stubbornness of a man who understood that the difference between justice and revenge is documentation. I had documentation. Schedule the FBI meeting, I told Patricia. This week. I'll call Marcus Webb this morning. I set the phone down. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over mine. It's almost over, she said. I looked at the cardinal on the branch. Vivid red against January gray. The kind of color that doesn't apologize for itself. For him, I said. Yes, Trevor Ashby had walked out of my building in the January dark carrying 212 photographs of documents that would tell him nothing useful. A document box full of carefully constructed misdirection and the absolute certainty that he had finally won. What he was actually carrying was the key to his own prison cell. There are things a marriage accumulates over 41 years that have nothing to do with property or shared history. Things that live in the space between two people, understood, unspoken, carried quietly because the moment to say them never quite arrived, or because saying them felt like it would cost something that couldn't be recovered. Margaret had been carrying one of those things for 9 years. She told me on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Trevor's visit to the building. We were in the kitchen again. We have had most of our important conversations in that kitchen, which I suppose is what kitchens are actually for, underneath all the cooking. She was making oatmeal she didn't end up eating. I was on my second coffee. The January light was coming through the window at the low angle it comes in at this time of year. Long and thin, touching everything gently. She had been quieter than usual since the night of the alarm. Not withdrawn. Margaret is not a withdrawn person, but thoughtful in a way that had weight to it. Like someone preparing to put something down that they have been carrying for a long time and are not certain their arms will know what to do without it. I need to tell you something, she said. She was still facing the stove. All right, I said. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. Not defensively, but in the way she holds herself when she is steadying herself for something. The night before Trevor and Diane's rehearsal dinner, she said. 2012. I drove over to their apartment to drop off Diane's grandmother's pearl earrings. She had asked to borrow them for the ceremony. She paused. Diane wasn't home. Trevor said she had gone to the pharmacy and would be back in 20 minutes. He invited me in to wait. I watched her face. I went to use the bathroom, she continued. And when I came back through the hallway, Trevor was at the kitchen table. He had Diane's handbag open in front of him. Not just open, he was going through it. Methodically. Wallet, phone, a folder of documents she kept in there. Her voice was steady, but something behind it was not. He heard me coming and closed the bag before he turned around. Said he had been looking for her phone to call her. Let her know I was there. The kitchen was very quiet. It wasn't a search for a phone, Margaret said. He had been through everything in that bag. I could see the way it had been disturbed. 40 years of watching you work with precise hands, I know the difference between someone who touched something and someone who cataloged it. She looked at me directly. I knew it wasn't innocent. I felt it immediately and completely. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. My voice came out more even than I expected. Because the rehearsal dinner was the next night. Because the wedding was in 4 days. She uncrossed her arms. Because Diane was the happiest I had seen her in years, and I told myself I was being a paranoid mother who couldn't accept that her daughter had chosen someone and was leaving. She looked at her hands. I told myself 100 things over the next 9 years. That I had misread it. That he had a reasonable explanation. That bringing it up would make me the person who tried to ruin her marriage over a feeling I couldn't prove. I set down my coffee cup. I thought about telling you the night before the wedding. She continued. I almost knocked on your study door at midnight. But you were all ready, so you had that look you get when you have decided something. When you have made your peace with a thing. You had decided to accept him. And I thought, if I tell Eugene now, one of two things happens. Either we say something to Diane and she marries him anyway and we lose her, or we say nothing and carry it together. And carrying it together felt... She stopped. Safer, I said. Lonelier, she said. Carrying it alone was lonelier. I should have told you that night. We should have carried it together from the beginning. I stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she was standing and put my arms around her. She stood stiffly for a moment. Margaret has always taken a beat to accept comfort. Another thing I have known for 41 years, and then she leaned in. We both saw it, I said. Different moments. Same instinct. We both made the same choice. We were wrong. Yes. It cost her 9 years. Yes. She was quiet against my shoulder for a moment. Outside, a car passed. The oatmeal had gone cold on the stove. Do you think she would have listened? Margaret asked. If we had said something before the wedding, do you think it would have changed anything? I thought about it honestly, the way Margaret deserves to have things thought about. I don't know, I said. Maybe she would have defended him. Maybe it would have pushed her toward him. But maybe one voice, one person she trusted saying I saw something that worried me. Maybe that would have been enough to make her look twice. We'll never know. No, I said. We won't. She pulled back and looked at me. Her eyes were dry. Margaret cries at movies and at Gracie's school performances and at the particular song from our wedding that still comes on the radio sometimes. She does not cry at the hard things. She faces them. We know now, she said. We know now. I agreed. She straightened up, reached past me and turned off the burner under the oatmeal she wasn't going to eat. Eugene. Margaret. When this is over, when Diane knows everything and Trevor is gone, we tell her about what I saw, about what you saw at that first dinner. All of it. She met my eyes. No more carrying things alone. I took her hand. No more, I said. This time, it was going to matter. Patricia Odom's office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville has a particular quality I have always appreciated. It looks exactly like what it is. No artwork chosen to impress, no furniture selected to signal wealth, just a working space organized by someone who thinks clearly and has no interest in performing otherwise. Books on the shelves that have been read, files on the desk that are active, a window overlooking the Cumberland River that she probably never looks at because she is always looking at the work. I had retained her in January on Frank's recommendation, 3 days after I found the transmitter in the archive room. In the 11 months since, we had met 7 times, spoken by phone perhaps 40 more, and built something together that she described, with characteristic understatement, as a comprehensive file. She called it comprehensive. Marcus Webb, when he saw it, used a different word. The FBI meeting was on a Friday morning in the 3rd week of January, 10 days after Trevor's visit to the building. Patricia's conference room held 4 of us, Patricia, myself, Marcus Webb, and a younger agent named Carla Reyes, who handled digital evidence documentation for the Nashville field office. Frank had sent his analysis files ahead. Harold's surveillance footage had been transferred and authenticated. Dr. Lena Cho's forensic report on the transmitter was in the package. Patricia had organized everything into a presentation that moved chronologically, methodically, without drama, which was the right way to present it because the facts themselves contained all the drama necessary. Marcus Webb was 46, lean, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending 2 decades in rooms where things are decided. He had reviewed the preliminary materials before the meeting. He sat through Patricia's presentation without taking notes, which told me he was memorizing rather than recording another old habit, like Harold's. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Harwell," he said. "In 22 years of white-collar investigations, I have rarely seen a private citizen construct a case this complete before contacting law enforcement." He looked at the evidence binders stacked at his end of the table. "You have the physical intrusion on camera. You have the digital access logs. You have the financial connection to Vantara. You have the surveillance footage from your neighbor. You have the forensic analysis of the transmitter. You have the USB drive with the original files and the metadata establishing intent predating the marriage." He paused. "This is not a difficult case. This is a prosecutor's gift." "Haluarifi, will it be enough?" I asked. "More than enough," Carla Reyes said from her end of the table, not looking up from the digital evidence files she had been reviewing. "The metadata alone establishes premeditation. Everything else is confirmation." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "We can move on this within the week. I want 48 hours to position surveillance on Ashby and to coordinate with the Atlanta field office regarding Vantara Group. We'll want to take both simultaneously if Ashby gets wind of the Vantara action before we move on him. He may destroy evidence." "Understood," I said. "There's one more thing." I slid a folder across the conference table. Marcus opened it. He read the first page. Then he read it again, more slowly. Carla looked up from her laptop. "Mr. Harwell," Marcus said carefully, "this appears to be a record of communications between yourself and a senior acquisitions director at Vantara Group." "It is." "Conducted over a period of..." He checked the dates. 6 weeks?" "Yes." "In which you represented yourself as an independent broker with access to the Harwell Naturals formula documentation." "Correct." He set the folder down and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face during the previous hour of evidence presentation. Something between professional reassessment and what I suspected, in a man as controlled as Marcus Webb, passed for surprise. "You inserted yourself into their acquisition pipeline," he said. "I needed to know the full scope of what they were buying and why. I also needed documented confirmation that they knew the acquisition involved stolen intellectual property. A buyer who thinks they are purchasing legitimately acquired formulas is a different legal situation than a buyer who has been explicitly told the material was obtained without the owner's consent." "And were they told?" I tapped the folder. Page 4. Third paragraph. "The acquisitions director, in writing, confirmed they understood the material was being obtained outside of any authorized sale process and that this was factored into the pricing structure." I paused. "They paid a premium specifically because it was stolen. They considered the legal risk a known variable and priced it accordingly." Marcus looked at Patricia. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had known this was in the file for 3 weeks and had been waiting for this moment with considerable patience. "The Vantara case just became federal," Carla said quietly. "It was already federal," Patricia said. "This makes it airtight." Marcus closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture I interpreted as a man organizing his thoughts before speaking carefully. "Mr. Harwell," he said. I need to ask you directly. In these 6 weeks of communications with Vantara, did you at any point represent that you would actually deliver the formula documentation? No, I said. I represented that I had access to it and was evaluating terms. I never committed to delivery. Every communication was structured around their confirmation of intent, not my confirmation of supply. He nodded slowly. Patricia reviewed this with you before you began the communications. Every exchange was drafted with her guidance and reviewed before sending. He picked up the folder again and looked at the cover page. 6 weeks, he said, almost to himself. I needed them on record, I said. Trevor was always going to be catchable. He is one man with one plan. But Vantara is a corporation with attorneys and resources and the institutional capacity to claim ignorance if the paper trail isn't explicit enough to foreclose that option. I looked at him steadily. I needed to foreclose that option. Marcus Webb looked at me across the conference table for a long moment. Then he did something I had not expected. He smiled, small, controlled. The smile of a man who does not smile often in professional settings, and means it when he does. Mr. Harwell, he said, I've been negotiating with them for 6 weeks. Trevor arrived at our house on a Sunday afternoon in late January, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with a law firm's logo, and wearing the particular expression of a man who believes he is doing someone a favor. I recognized the portfolio. He had carried it to our house once before, 2 years ago, when he had presented a proposal for restructuring Harwell Natural's board composition. That time I had listened politely and declined. This time, I knew exactly what was inside it before he set it on our coffee table. Margaret had made coffee. She had also made the lemon pound cake she makes for significant occasions, birthdays, holidays, moments that require something that took effort. She set it on the table between us without comment and sat down beside me on the couch. Diane sat in the armchair to my left, her hands folded in her lap. Gracie was at the kitchen table doing homework, visible through the doorway, her colored pencils arranged by shade in the particular order she preferred. Trevor sat across from us and opened the portfolio with the smooth, practiced movement of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Eugene. Margaret, he began, his voice carrying the warm, careful tone of someone delivering difficult news with compassion. We've been watching you both manage an incredibly difficult few months. The memory lapses, the confusion at work, the incidents Frank mentioned. He paused with practiced weight. We love you both, and because we love you, we felt it was time to have an honest conversation about what comes next. He slid a document across the coffee table. I picked it up with hands I allowed to tremble slightly, not enough to be theatrical, just enough to be consistent with the performance he had been watching for 10 months. I scanned the first page with the unhurried attention of a man trying to parse language that was giving him difficulty. It was a guardianship petition. My name at the top, Diane listed as primary guardian, Trevor listed as co-guardian with full operational authority over Harwell Naturals during any period of declared incapacity. Full operational authority? The phrase was buried in the third paragraph, in a subordinate clause. Positioned between language about medical decision-making and financial oversight, in a way designed to make it look like a minor administrative detail rather than the entire point of the document. 40 years of reading research papers, patents, and contracts. I found it in 11 seconds. This is a lot of legal language, I said, setting the document down with careful, deliberate slowness. I'm not sure I follow all of it. What exactly happens to Harwell Naturals if I sign this It just means that on days when you're having difficulty, I can step in and keep things running smoothly." Trevor said. His smile was perfect. His voice was warm. Everything about him was calibrated and professional, and I thought about a folder structure created 9 months before his wedding, and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the January outside. "Diane," I said, turning to my daughter, "is this what you want?" She met my eyes. In them I saw the thing we had discussed at the Blue Lantern in December, the careful balance she was maintaining between the role she was playing for Trevor's benefit and the truth she was carrying for mine. She had been doing it for 6 weeks with a steadiness that made me understand, not for the first time, that whatever Trevor had tried to diminish in her had not touched the core of who she was. "Dad," she said, and her voice was gentle and genuine and cost her something. I could see that. "I just want you to be taken care of." She was not lying. She did want me to be taken care of. The lie was Trevor's, the document, the framing, the manufactured urgency, not hers. "I'd like to think about it," I said. I set the document down and looked at Trevor with the slightly unfocused expression I had been maintaining for 10 months. "Can I keep this, look it over with some time?" Of course," Trevor said, smoothly. "Take all the time you need. We just want what's best for you." Gracie appeared in the doorway, drawn by the silence the way children are drawn by silences they sense but don't understand. "Is there cake?" she asked. Margaret cut her a slice without getting up. The particular efficiency of a grandmother who has been anticipating this request. And Gracie retreated back to her homework, with the satisfied focus of a child who has confirmed that adults are fine and there is dessert. Trevor watched her go with the expression he always wore around Gracie: fond, natural, the most convincing thing about him. Whatever he was good with that child. I had never been able to fully reconcile that. I had stopped trying. After another 20 minutes of careful, managed conversation, Trevor and Diane stood to leave. Trevor collected the portfolio I gave him back, the guardianship papers, saying I wanted to review the copy he had left, and shook my hand at the door with the warm, firm grip of a man who believed the ground was already shifting under me in the direction he intended. "We'll talk this week," he said. "No pressure. We're just here for you." I nodded and thanked him and stood in the doorway, watching them walk to their car. Diane glanced back once, a small look, neutral, unreadable to anyone who didn't know what it carried. I held it for a second and then let it go. Trevor opened the car door and looked back at the house, at me, standing in the doorway of the home he had been circling for 9 years. His expression in that moment was the most honest thing I had ever seen on his face. It was the expression of a man who thought he had already won. He turned back to the car and got in. I stood in the doorway until their taillights had disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside and called Marcus Webb. The meeting was set for Tuesday morning. 2 days. Trevor thought he had already won. He hadn't. Trevor Ashby arrived at Harwell Naturals at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in February, wearing his best suit and carrying the same leather portfolio he had brought to our house on Sunday. He thought he was coming to witness a signing. I watched him cross the parking lot from the window of my office, unhurried, confident. The walk of a man who has decided the outcome of a meeting before he enters the room. He had dressed for an occasion. The charcoal suit was the one he wore to important events. I had seen it at Gracie's school recitals and at 2 company holiday parties, and once at a charity dinner in Belle Meade, where he had spent 40 minutes talking to a pharmaceutical industry contact I had noted but not mentioned. He thought this was an occasion worth dressing for. He was right about that, at least. The conference room at Harwell Naturals seats 12. That morning, it held 7. Trevor and Diane on one side of the table, Margaret and I on the other, with Frank to my right. Patricia Odom sat at the far end with her document cases stacked neatly beside her chair. Carla Reyes from the FBI sat beside Patricia with a laptop already open. Marcus Webb was not yet in the room. That was by design. Trevor scanned the room when he entered, and I watched the small recalibration behind his eyes, the quick assessment of an unexpected configuration, rapidly processed and filed. He settled on Patricia. "I don't believe we've met," he said pleasantly. "Patricia Odom," she said. "I'm Mr. Harwell's attorney." A beat. "I wasn't aware Eugene had retained counsel for this. He retained me 11 months ago," Patricia said, with the particular neutrality of a woman who has spent 24 years saying difficult things without inflection. "Please, sit down." Trevor sat. He set the portfolio on the table in front of him with the deliberate placement of a man establishing territory. He glanced at Diane, who was looking at her hands. He glanced at me. I gave him the slightly unfocused expression he had been reading as decline for 10 months. He visibly relaxed. "Eugene," he began, opening the portfolio. "I know this feels like a lot of people for what is essentially a family conversation. Before we get to the documents," I said, "I'd like to share a few things first. Frank, would you pull up the first file?" Frank opened his laptop. The wall-mounted screen at the end of the room lit up. The first image was a still frame from camera 3, the archive room. Timestamp reading 2:17 in the morning. January 21st. Trevor in dark clothing, kneeling at the filing cabinet, his face clearly visible in 3/4 profile. The room went very still. Trevor looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. Not panic, not yet, but the first fracture in the confidence he had carried into the room. He looked at me. I looked back at him with an expression that was no longer unfocused. "That's our archive room," I said pleasantly. January 21st, approximately 2:17 in the morning. I nodded to Frank. Next one. The second image was a wider shot Trevor at the work table. Document box open. Phone held above a page. Photographing. The timestamp read 2:23. "That sequence runs for 19 minutes, I said. 212 photographs in total. Camera 3 captured most of them clearly enough to read the document titles." I paused. "Frank, the access logs." The screen changed to a spreadsheet, 43 rows, each one a timestamp, device ID, and query record. Unauthorized access to the digital archive. 11 months of systematic mapping, documented to the second. Trevor's hand had moved to his portfolio and stopped there, resting on the leather without opening it. A man whose plan has just changed, needing a moment to find the new one. "These are fabricated," he said. His voice was still controlled, still smooth. "Someone has clearly gone to considerable effort to..." The transmitter is on page 4, Patricia said, sliding a document across the table. "Installed behind the server panel in the archive room. Forensic analysis confirmed military-grade encryption. Installation timestamp matches the Saturday in October when you were the only person in the building." She slid another document. "Your fingerprints on the hardware. FBI lab confirmed that last week." Diane had not looked up from her hands. Trevor looked at her. "Diane." His voice carried a new register, the warm, reasonable tone he used when he needed her to choose him. You know this isn't what it looks like. Your father has been— There's one more thing, I said. Frank pressed a key. The room filled with sound. Trevor's voice, clear and unhurried, coming from a recording made in the archive room on the night of January 21st, captured by the audio monitoring system I had installed in September. And the documentation is complete. Tell them I'll need the account details for the transfer by end of week. If the authentication checks out, we move forward as discussed. 3.2 million wire transfer. Same structure as the deposit. A pause on the recording. Then a second voice, female, professional. Vantara confirms receipt of the sample files. Authentication is proceeding. We'll have the transfer details to you by Thursday. Good. Make sure it routes through the same shell as before. I don't want anything traceable back to— Frank stopped the recording. The conference room was absolutely silent. Trevor's hand was still on the portfolio. His face had the quality of a man doing rapid internal calculation, assessing exits, evaluating options, searching for the version of this situation that still had a favorable outcome. I had watched that face for 9 years, and I recognized the moment when the calculation came up empty. It came up empty now. The door opened. Marcus Webb stepped in. Marcus Webb moved through a room the way certain men move without announcing himself, without requiring space to be made, simply occupying it with the unhurried certainty of someone who has walked into difficult rooms for 22 years and knows exactly what they are walking into. He set his credentials on the table without ceremony. Trevor Ashby, he said. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI White Collar Crimes Division, Nashville Field Office. He placed a second document beside his credentials, a federal warrant, folded once. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges including theft of intellectual property, conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, and unlawful transfer of proprietary data to a foreign entity. There are additional charges pending regarding your coordination with Vantara Group, whose Atlanta offices are being simultaneously searched as of 9:58 this morning. Trevor stood. The portfolio fell from the table and landed on the floor, the leather cover splaying open, the guardianship papers fanning out across the carpet. Nobody looked at them. This is not— Trevor began. Mr. Ashby. Marcus's voice carried no particular emphasis. It didn't need to. I would strongly advise you to stop speaking without counsel present. Anything you say in this room is being recorded. Trevor looked at Diane. She was looking at the table. Something shifted in him then. I watched it happen, the last recalibration, the final internal accounting of a man who has run every calculation available to him and found that none of them lead anywhere useful. The smoothness left his face. What replaced it was not grief and not remorse. It was something colder and more honest than either. You did this, he said to me. His voice was flat, stripped of the warmth he had practiced for 9 years. The evidence did this, I said. He looked around the room. At Frank, who met his gaze steadily and said nothing. At Patricia, who was already organizing documents with the focused efficiency of someone whose work here was complete. At Carla Reyes, whose laptop was still open and recording. At Margaret, who was looking at him with an expression I recognized, the expression of a woman who saw something true 9 years ago and chose silence and has been living with that choice ever since. Then he looked at Diane again. She looked up this time. She met his eyes across the conference table, and what passed between them in that moment I cannot fully describe because it was not mine to witness completely. 9 years of marriage, a child they had raised together, a life constructed on a foundation that had never existed. "You helped him," Trevor said, not accusatory, almost wondering, as if the concept of his wife's agency had genuinely not entered his calculations. Diane did not answer. Something broke open in him then. The composure, so carefully maintained through the evidence presentation, through the audio recording, through Marcus Webb's entrance, came apart completely, and what came through was the particular ugliness of a man who has lost and knows it, and cannot find the dignity to lose quietly. "You want to know the truth." His voice rose, sharp and sudden in the quiet room. He was looking at Diane, but speaking to all of us. 9 years. 9 years of Sunday dinners and holiday performances, and pretending to care about herb extraction processes and organic compound ratios. He laughed once a sound, with nothing in it. "Do you know what that costs? Do you have any idea what it takes to sit across from a man for 9 years and pretend to respect what he built, when what he built was a $15 million asset sitting behind a padlock that a first-year MBA could have opened?" "Mr. Ashby." Marcus said, "She was a door." Trevor's voice dropped back to something cold and precise. He was looking at Diane now, only at Diane. "That's what I needed. A door, into the building, into the family, into the files. You were—" "That's enough." My voice came out quieter than I expected, quieter than I felt. The room went silent. Trevor looked at me. For the first time in 9 years, the calculation was completely gone from his face. What was left was smaller than I had expected. A man without the performance was a much smaller thing than the performance had suggested. "You were never going to win," I said. "Not because I'm smarter than you, because you were building on nothing. Everything you constructed here, the access, the trust, the position, you built it on people who actually loved each other. And that is the one material that does not behave the way you expect it to." Marcus nodded to Carla. She closed her laptop and stood. The process that followed was efficient and without drama, which was how Marcus Webb conducted things. Trevor was advised of his rights. His hands were secured. He did not speak again. He walked out of the conference room with the careful, reduced posture of a man who has had something taken from him that he did not understand he was wearing until it was gone. The room was very quiet after the door closed. Patricia began organizing her files. Frank closed his laptop. Margaret's hand found mine under the table and stayed there. Diane sat without moving for a long moment. Then she reached down and picked up one of the guardianship papers that had fallen from the portfolio. She looked at it at her own name printed at the top as primary guardian, at the language about protecting and caring for her father, and set it back on the table face down. From somewhere in the building, small footsteps. The conference room door opened 4 inches, and Gracie's face appeared in the gap. She had been in the break room with Beverly, Harold's wife, who had offered to sit with her during the meeting. Her eyes moved around the room assessing, the way she assessed everything, with the particular attention of a child who collects things and knows that most things have more to them than their surface suggests. "Grandpa." Her voice was careful. "Is everything okay?" I looked at my granddaughter in the doorway. 11 years old. Paint-stained fingers from the watercolors she had brought to occupy herself. The orange coat that had started all of this draped over her arm. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. And for the first time in 8 months, I didn't have to pretend. Justice doesn't feel the way you think it will. I had expected something larger, some sense of completion, of weight lifted. of the particular satisfaction that comes when a long calculation finally resolves. What I got instead was quieter than that acetling, like a house after a storm has passed. When everything is still and you go from room to room checking what held and what didn't. Most things held. Trevor Ashby was arraigned on federal charges in the last week of February. Patricia attended with Carla Reyes and called me afterward with the summary and her characteristic economy of language multiple counts. Consecutive sentencing recommended. No bail granted given the international dimensions of the Vantara connection. The Atlanta offices of Vantara Group had been searched simultaneously with Trevor's arrest, as Marcus had planned. 3 executives had been charged. The acquisition pipeline had been shut down. 40,000 customers' formula data protected. Harwell Naturals intact. Diane filed for divorce the morning after the arrest. She did it herself, from her own phone, using an email account she had created the previous December at the Blue Lantern Cafe in Franklin on a device Trevor had never known about. She told me this detail later, almost in passing, and I thought about the woman who had called me from a Walgreens parking lot in November, with her voice pitched low so she wouldn't be heard, and the woman who filed her own divorce papers 12 weeks later, and how much distance a person can travel in 3 months when they finally have somewhere to go. She moved back into her old bedroom at our house with Gracie the week after the arrest. Temporary, she said. Just until she found her footing. I told her temporary was fine. I told her there was no timeline. I told her the room had always been hers and would continue to be, and that the only person who had ever suggested otherwise had just been escorted out of a conference room by a federal agent, so his opinion on the matter could be safely disregarded. She almost laughed at that. Almost. The almost was enough. It was the closest thing to the old laugh I had heard in 9 years, and I held on to it the way you hold on to the first warm day in a Tennessee February, carefully, not yet trusting it to last, but grateful for its presence. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of aftermath not healed, not broken, but in the process of finding out which was which. Diane moved through our house quietly, occupying the spaces she had grown up in with the careful attention of someone relearning a language they once spoke fluently. She helped Margaret in the kitchen. She drove Gracie to school. She sat on the back porch in the mornings with coffee, watching the February yard do what February yards do in Tennessee, waiting, gray and patient, for the season to change. I did not push. Margaret did not push. We had both learned, at considerable cost, the difference between a door held open and a door forced. On a Thursday morning in March, I asked her to meet me at Harwell Naturals. She arrived at 9, in jeans and a canvas jacket, her hair down. She looked like herself, more like herself, I thought, than she had looked in a very long time. Not the careful, managed version of herself she had maintained through 9 years of Trevor's construction. Just Diane. Just my daughter. I took her to the lab. It was the original space, the room where I had spent 30 years developing formulas, where she had sat on a stool as a little girl watching me work, where she had first learned to read a spectrometer readout and understand what it meant. I had kept it as it was. Updated equipment, same organization, same quality of light from the north-facing windows that made it good for precise work. I showed her the filing system, the research logs, the formula documentation, the real documentation, returned from the off-site storage where Frank and I had moved it in December. 30 years of work, intact, organized, accessible. Then I took her to my office and set a document on the desk between us. She looked at it. then at me. "Dad, I've been thinking about this for longer than you know," I said. "This isn't because of what happened. It isn't a reaction. It's something I should have done years ago and didn't because I was holding on to something I should have been passing forward." The document was a transfer of ownership, Harwell Naturals, in its entirety, to Diane Harwell, her maiden name, which she had already begun using again on the divorce paperwork. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I'll still be in the lab. I'll still be involved in the research. But the company should be yours. It always should have been." She looked at the document for a long moment. I watched her read it the way I had watched her read things since she was 7 years old, carefully, completely, not moving on until she understood each piece. Then she picked up the pen. She signed her name, Diane Harwell, clear and deliberate, and set the pen down. We walked out of the office together, through the corridor, to the front entrance of the building. Above the door, the company sign caught the March morning light, the way it had caught light for 30 years. Harwell Naturals, Est. 1994. Her name was already on it. It always had been. 3 months after the arrest, I found myself standing in the doorway of Harwell Naturals' main lab, watching my daughter work. She didn't look up when I came in. She was at the center bench with her back slightly curved, the way she had always held herself when she was focused, left hand steadying a sample container, right hand making notations in the research log with the small, precise handwriting she had developed in graduate school and apparently never lost. The north-facing windows threw clean March light across the bench. Outside, Nashville was moving toward spring the way it does gradually. Then suddenly, the dogwoods deciding all at once that winter had gone on long enough. She had started 3 weeks earlier, not with any title or ceremony, just as a researcher who needed a bench and access to 30 years of documented work and the quiet of a lab in the early morning before anyone else arrived. She came in at 7 most days. Some mornings I arrived at 8 to find 3 pages of notes already on her desk and her coffee half gone. She was rebuilding from the foundation, relearning techniques the field had advanced past in the years she had been away, moving carefully, without rushing. The way you move when you understand that solid ground is worth more than quick progress. Some days were harder. I knew which ones without being told. She was quieter, more deliberate, spending longer than necessary on routine tasks, the way you do when what you actually need is for time to pass at a manageable pace. On those days, I made coffee and left a cup on her bench and asked nothing. On days like this one, she sank into the work the way you sink into something you have been away from long enough to miss properly. And the hours disappeared. And she looked like the woman who had once told me we were going to change the world together. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to find Gracie. She was in the small conference room we had converted into a temporary art space, her condition for spending Saturday mornings at the lab while Diane worked. A reasonable negotiation. She had covered the table with brown paper and arranged her watercolors in the order she preferred: warm colors left, cool colors right. The ones she called in between, occupying the middle in a classification system she periodically revised. She was painting. I sat across from her and looked at the work in progress. Larger than her usual pieces. The full width of the paper, worked in loose, confident strokes. Our backyard in Brentwood, the oak tree, the back porch, the kitchen window with light inside. 4 figures in the yard. Small, rendered simply, the way she rendered people's suggestions of posture rather than precise likenesses, but recognizable. A tall figure with gray hair, a shorter one beside him, a young woman standing slightly apart, looking up at the oak tree, a small figure in an orange coat, arms out, in the middle of everything. "Who's that one?" I asked, pointing to the young woman. Gracie glanced up. "Mom. She's looking at the cardinal. There's always one in that tree in the mornings. She watches it when she has her coffee." She returned to her work. "I've been watching her watch it." I looked at the painting for a long time. There are moments that arrive quietly, without announcing themselves, that turn out to be the ones you carry. Not the dramatic ones, not the arrest or the conference room or the federal warrant. Those matter, but they don't stay the same way. What stays is a granddaughter at a paper-covered table, painting her mother watching a cardinal, because she has been paying attention to what her mother finds beautiful. What stays is knowing that in the middle of everything her family had been through, Gracie had been quietly cataloging the moments her mother looked at something with care. That is not something Trevor Ashby planned for. It cannot be accounted for in a folder structure or a financial projection. It is what happens in families that hold the small, persistent accumulations of attention that survive everything you put them through and are still there when the larger drama is finished. I thought about what I would say to anyone who recognized something in this story, who had their own version of a long table and a leather portfolio and a smile that arrived half a second too late. Trust what you see. Not immediately, not recklessly, but trust it. The instinct that tells you something is wrong in your family is usually right. The question is not whether to act, but how. With patience, with documentation, with the understanding that the people you love deserve to see the truth themselves rather than being told what to believe. And keep the light on. Whatever room in your life corresponds to that lab, whatever space you have held open for the person you hope comes back, keep it. Don't take the name off the door. Don't dismantle the bench. Don't accept that the diminished version of someone you love is the final version. People come back. Not always. Not on your timeline. But they come back when the door is open and someone they trust has refused, stubbornly, to stop waiting. I am 67 years old. I have been called a stubborn old man by someone who meant it as an insult. He was right. I am stubborn. It is the best thing about me. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I am glad. Leave a comment and tell me what would you have done differently. What would you have done the same? If you know someone carrying something like this quietly, without knowing how to set it down, share this with them. Sometimes the most useful thing one stubborn person can do is remind another that they are not alone. Thank you for staying until the end.